extremely loud and incredibly close, and eating animals, and just most recently, trio codes. And ever since I read Everything is Illuminated, I'm a huge fan, and I know there are many other fans in the audience tonight. So, as you know, tonight's event is the 2010 Tzvi Daremblum Memorial Lecture. So just before I turn the floor over to Leon and Jonathan, I'd like to invite Al Altschul just to say a few words about Tzvi Daremblum.
Thank you, Karen. It's a pleasure to welcome everybody here tonight to Kesher, Israel. This is the third year that we've had a speaker thanks to the generosity of the Daremblum family. In memory of their son, Tzvi Daremblum, the family has been very generous and supportive of this lecture series here at Kesher, Israel. We've been honored in prior years to have many distinguished people here. Tonight continues that tradition. The family, in addition to sponsoring the lecture and underwriting the cost of this evening, also provides a scholarship during the year to Kesher, Israel for study either abroad or in Israel to further Jewish education. It is through families like this, the Daremblum family, who are here tonight, that this synagogue, as well as the Jewish community, continues to thrive. We thank you. We are pleased to have you as members. We thank you for your generosity, support, and we look forward to a very enjoyable evening tonight. Karen did mention, I want to thank her. She's done a lot of work to put all the activity together tonight, to organize it. Also, a special thanks to Mark Isakowitz, Ilani Jakovovitz, and to Ken Weinstein for helping to arrange all the particulars for this evening. Most of you who are active in any organization know that this doesn't happen without a lot of work and effort by many people. And we're very privileged here at the synagogue to have many people participate in a variety of activities. This is the 100th year anniversary of Kesher, Israel. We are having a variety of lectures and discussions throughout the year. Some have already been held. Some will be held in 2011. We encourage all of you that are here tonight to come to some of our further activities and invite your friends as well. After the discussion tonight, there'll be a book signing downstairs. We have books for sale by the author. And without further ado, I'll turn it over and Leon get started.
Thank you, Al. It's a great pleasure for me to have my cherished friend, Jonathan Safran Foer here, and my cherished jewel, Jonathan Kesher Jonathan. And we're going to talk in an amusing and profound manner about a variety of subjects for about, 45 minutes or 40 minutes. And then we will take questions from the congregation, from the assembly. And I guess the first question I was going to ask you, let's talk a little bit about what it means to be a Jewish writer in America now, as opposed to what it meant for the ancestors. We can get to the ancestors. And my first question to you was a very basic one, which is, do you regard yourself as a Jewish writer? And in what sense do you regard yourself as a Jewish writer? If you do. And if you don't, you should, why not?
Well, first of all, thank you for your patience. I was not expecting to have to ask of you. I was planning on being here 4 or 5 hours early, actually.
It's a common problem with getting to shul.
Yeah. Yeah, about 3 years late.
Yeah, exactly. Yes.
But I'm grateful. And I also want to thank Leon for inviting me. I'm actually not a great lover of public speaking. I have a certain anxiety about it. I'm also not a great lover of leaving home. I have 2 small children and value my time with them. But Leon, as those of you who get to interact with him know, is utterly impossible to say no to. And I was thinking about Leon as I was stuck on the runway this morning, and thinking about how he's another reason I wish I still lived in D.C. And I don't think that there's a more important thinker of any kind in America right now. And it might be easy to lose sight of if you see him every day. But I guess that's the one gift of giving him another cigarette.
That's your answer to my question.
Yeah. In terms of Jewish writing, it's funny because it's one of those things that you're given occasion to think about and don't spontaneously think about. Or I should say that's the case for me. Certainly when I was writing, when I was at the beginning of my writing, I still am at the beginning of my writing, but when I was really at the beginning, the notion of unraveling what it might mean to be a Jewish writer never occurred to me. It was not on my radar, despite the fact that my favorite writers happen to be Jewish. I suppose I thought of it that way, that they happen to be Jewish. Of course, that's not the case. And as I became a published writer, I found that question popping up quite often, only from Jews, also. And I found it a strange question. Do you think of yourself as a Jewish writer? For two reasons. One, if I didn't, what would that say? I mean, it's like asking Aretha Franklin if she thinks of herself as a black singer. And if she were to say no, it would be very, very, that would require a lot of explaining.
Yeah, it would be immensely interesting.
Yeah. But the second thing is that my relationship to the question really has changed, and it changes. I mean, I think, when you say, do you think of yourself as a Jewish writer, I want to say as opposed to what? And I don't mean as opposed to a Christian writer. I mean, what is my answer standing in opposition to? Why is it being asked? If it's asked of me as it has been when I've been in Germany, it feels very different than when it's being asked right now. It feels very different in a religious setting than it does in a purely secular setting. What I can say is, it's probably confronting the question has probably been the most enriching thing about being a writer. Writing has a way of offering up self-portrait. I don't think it's more or less accurate necessarily than the other self-portraits that are reflections that are offered up in life. But it's often the most surprising kind. And the thing that has surprised me most about my writing is how Jewish it often feels, and also how Judaism has been this kind of magnet that my imagination keeps being pulled toward, often despite myself. Why despite myself? That's another question. But
I mean, the assumption behind the question about are you a Jewish writer, there are two assumptions that I think we should put some intellectual pressure on or just ignore. The first one, of course, is the assumption that a writer, first and foremost, is a representative of the group. And when I ask you that question, if anything, if insofar as a writer is a Jewish writer, an American writer, that writer is an unrepresentative of the group. There's some dialectical relation between belonging to the group, expressing the group, but not expressing the group. And the second thing, of course, is when one says that so-and-so is a Jewish writer, I see that, it begs the question, which is Jewish in what way? Because there are so many, Bellow used to say that he was not a Jewish writer. But for example, there's that great scene in Herzog where he gets drunk and he sings a song under the window. And the song that he sings under the window is Al taster panecha mimeni, I'm broke without a penny, which nobody can deny. Now, it's it would be odd to claim that was not the work of a Jewish writer. So when you put some pressure on it, the thing I always need to know is, well, what kind of Jewish writer?
But also, we haven't made a division between what do you strive or intend to be and how do you understand the way that you're received. Because those are two very different things.
Absolutely.
I know that I am considered a Jewish writer. And I know that, I think it's probably the case for any novel in America right now that there are a disproportionate number of Jewish readers of that book. But with my writing, my audience is disproportionately Jewish. So that's one thing, and we can talk and think about that together. The other thing is it's something that I strive to, that while I am writing, I'm conscious of or identifying with. So, Auden said that I look at what I write so that I can see what I think. And that's always been my experience. I don't sit down as a Jewish writer any more than I sit down as anything, really. It's through the act of writing that I come to terms with who I am and what I'm thinking and what I'm feeling. It wasn't until I started writing that I realized how wrong I had been about what I thought and what I felt I felt. Right. And having that reflection sent back and having so many of the stories being either having explicit Jewish content or a kind of Jewish flavor. Maybe that's What you're getting at.
Sometimes it is that. I mean, you look at a writer like Malcolm, who had stories that had obviously some had explicit Jewish content, but more than that, with Malcolm, it felt like the spirit of the Yiddish story had sort of been reincarnated in English, regardless of what he wrote about. So it was something intangible that you.
Well, I think there's a kind of recognition that when we think of Jewish writing, I think often what I mean when I speak about Jewish writing is writing that offers a sense of a kind of recognition for me, like a kind of antidote to alienation or loneliness. I mean, the quintessential Jewish writing is the Jewish joke, at least in the last 50 years. And Jewish humor is so effective because it announces a we. Look how foolish we are, look how cheap we are, look how short we are. What the point of the jokes, I think, is not the short and the cheap, but the we. And I mean, the feeling of I assume you do, of exchanging Jewish jokes with a group of people that you trust.
It's a form of esoteric literature.
But I mean, the thing that draws me to Jewish writers is not that they're writing about Israel, and it's not that they're writing about the 20th century Jewish experience, but this feeling of recognition, which is actually independent of all of the circumstances of the story.
What you say that interests me, the remark you make about discovering the Jewishness, either in spirit or in substance or content of what you write as an antidote to alienation, that actually marks you and some of the other American Jewish writers of your generation as very different from the generations that preceded you. Because the question, when Bellow or Roth or the others were asked about the Jewishness of their writing, inevitably the conversation came around to anxieties about Jewishness. And the Jewishness of the writing tended to be an expression of an anxiety about an identity that they held but did not hold and received, but resented having received and wished to transmit, but maybe didn't have a proper way to do it or a satisfactory way. But it was a very fraught question. And in your writing, it's not, one feels that Jewishness is not, it's a resource for you, but it's not a burden, it's not a pain, it's not a scar or something.
I think they were actually giving a very similar answer, just either stated in a different way or that was appropriate to their generation.
We're just sexing it up.
I mean, the reason that Portnoy's complaint, found such a wide Jewish audience is because of the recognition. I think that I was speaking about, readers recognize the anxiety. They recognize the burden, and that itself is something that is shared. So it's different now. From our generation, there are still anxieties and there are still burdens, but they're quite different. It's at least you'd say you're a generation removed from survivors at least. So, but I don't feel for me that it is a purely happy generative relationship. It is something that I wrestle with much more now that I have children.
They will do that.
Yeah, especially the little one.
I think that there are two things that literature can do in the way of the expression of one's identity. One is, the first thing is what you describe as the recognition. And I think you're right. In terms of recognition, Portnoy is the great American Jewish novel. There's no question about it. But what happened to people like Roth is that, and you see this also, by the way, I see it in other kinds of novels, for example, in the Anglo-Indian novel, all the stuff that came after Zadie's Smith's first book. There is, there is the experience of the reader's recognition. Yes, that's me. Yes, that's my group. You got me. You portrayed me correctly. How on earth did you know? And the reader was excited and flattered to be described that way, and you learn something and so on. But then there is the other function of a novel, a great novel, which happens less frequently in American Jewish writing in older generations, which is actually to lift the reader out of what they recognize into some new place, meaning either some new Jewish place, some obscure, some literary place, some imaginative place. And the problem with the I take responsibility for beginning the conversation with this rig question, is that it tends to leave we're speaking sociologically in some way, or at best psychologically, right? But we're not. But there's also the larger work of the imagination, which in fact brings me to your incredible first book. What you did in the first book, which was extraordinary, was you took probably the most tolerant subject of all. And it's a good thing that the subject of the Holocaust is tolerant. It's not a bad thing, because it means that, I thought you were talking about me. But that still is the most tolerant subject of war. There's no way you could transform that. But you took that subject, which was tired, because it had been pondered and pondered and pondered and attacked and assaulted in various ways. And you found a way, a bizarre way, I might add, but you found a way to really just explode it, to just bring it alive. And so maybe you could talk a little bit about Trochenbrod and about the first novel. I understand that it's incorrect to believe it was written in 20 minutes and so on, but maybe, and how you see it now. It came out when, in 2002, right? So it's almost 10 years. So can you talk a little bit about that and how it looks to you?
Sure. I should say I haven't reread it, since I published it. There's a history of Trochenbrod that was just published. It's
Yes, your brother showed it to me.
Yeah, and it's a very good book, actually. Trochenbrod was one of the most amazing places ever to have existed. It was the only entirely Jewish community outside of Israel. Apparently, in all of Jewish history. That sounds impossible to believe, but entirely Jewish.
I'd say maybe.
Okay. And it was growing at an incredible pace, and was becoming an important trade destination, an intellectual destination. Early Zionist fighters were being trained there. It's a place that is infinitely more magical than I made it in my book. And of course, it's entirely wiped out. My grandfather was from Trochenbrod. So in the summer after my junior year, I guess it was, of college, I decided that I would go to this place. I had no idea why. It was something that was to do it. If someone had presented me with the plane tickets, presented me with the translator and guide, and said, "We've got this all set up. Would you like to do it?" I would have said, "I'm not at all interested." And yet I found myself doing it. And I had a very bleak experience there, in large part because of history and what's left, which was nothing at all, and in large part because of the preparations that I made, which were none. So, the defining moment of my trip was when I had a little photo album that I was showing to Ukrainian villagers in a nearby village, and I had a picture of my grandma who came from a proximal shtetl, and I said, "Do you know this person?" He said, I think so. What was her name? I said, Ethel. And they said, what was her last name? I couldn't remember her maiden name. And if there were any piece of information if you can't remember your grandmother's maiden name, it's not a lot. Something like that. And that was the saddest thing that happened to me on the trip. And I went to Prague immediately after and spent about 8 weeks there, and I wrote something like a first draft, although it ended up changing so much it's hardly worth calling it a first draft. And at the time that I was writing it, I was reading for the first time Bruno Schultz, W. Grossman, not for the first time, but more intensely Kafka, Babel, and I discovered Charlotte Solomon for the first time, who, if you're not familiar with her work, Life or Theater, I think it's the greatest work of art ever made. And all of this was fomenting into this kind of creative energy, which was not just positive. It was very confusing. But it's something I haven't felt since, and I would love to feel it again. I've never
See, I had the opposite experience. About 4 years ago, I was invited to lecture in Krakow and decided that the Jewish God was telling me to go to Galicia and find the hometowns. So I made the trip into Ukraine and also looking for a very, very small place called Schodnica, which was a little town, hamlet, near Drahovich, where Bruno Schultz was. He taught my cousin, that's another story. But I had over-prepared in the sense that I went armed with Austro-Hungarian maps, and I had the address of schools. And at one point, I was looking, I got to the little hamlet, and I knew where where my grandparents' house would have been. It was described by my mother and others. It was a wooden house, so I didn't expect to find it. And I walked out into the field, and I kept looking, but here I started looking, and then I stopped myself and thought, what on earth am I doing? This is not a genealogical investigation. And I suddenly had this almost embarrassing feeling that it was becoming narcissistic because this was just one of 6 million stories. And I decided that however close I got, that's close enough. And that this is the place, however broadly, I was there. And then I had this and of course when I realized that, I was sort of done. My mission was accomplished. And then I had this very strange experience where I was carrying my backpack and I had brought to a Polish poet friend in Krakow, who wanted a copy of my book. And I had it in my backpack, and I suddenly, without knowing what I was doing, I stood in the middle of the field, I opened the backpack, I took my book, I put it on the ground, and I left. And my Ukrainian guide, my bodyguard, who was looking after me, was frightful Ukrainian called Bolek. If he wasn't my friend, would have been my enemy, I'm sure. Looked at me and he said, but your book is it's going to rain, it's going to snow, it's going to get into the ground. I said, that's the point. That's the point. And in that sense, I kind of decided that it wasn't any longer about me or my family. It was a remarkable moment of feeling sort of immersed in something larger. But you wrote this in 8 weeks in Prague.
I wrote some of it, some version of it. I came back, and I had Joyce Carlotto as my advisor in Princeton for a thesis. And I told her I wanted to work on it, and she read it. She was crazy about it. And it was, took me under her wing and really guided me, not in the sense of this chapter should be here, but you should work harder, you should work harder, you should work harder. And that's what she said every week, you should work harder. But your story is so interesting. I mean, I was confused by it because, the turn, I was expecting something different because when you got there, you were looking for the specific place, you thought there's something narcissistic about thinking that anything, I don't know, that there could be significance in the one among the many, the millions. And then, but you ended it with, almost pursuing that same line to its conclusion.
Almost. I ended it sort of having the last word in some symbolic way, meaning that, standing in that field, I suddenly realized that the book that I'd written was the book that was never supposed to be written. This was the book that was supposed to have been prevented from being written. So I did have this very humbling feeling when I finally got there. And the other feeling I have, which I'm sure you share, is that until you go there, you're always imagining the topography, and especially the forests. And the forests were the most frightening things. The forests I could barely go near because those were the forests. And I was relieved finally not to have to imagine. Because my mother, we came from, there's oil in Ukraine, and I used to be an oil tycoon. Unfortunately for this congregation, I'm not one anymore. But and there was all these legends and these myths and so on. And it was good finally to be able to see it, to visualize, to remember it in some way, except for the forests, which scared the daylights out.
I found the scariest thing about the forest was how casual those still living around them dealt with them. And they're not callous, bad people. These are the same people who would cry when I showed them photographs, not recognizing anybody, but recognizing what I wanted. You start walking, and I'm sure it's around here somewhere. It's here, it's not inside the forest trying to find these mass burial plots. I know it's here. Is it a left? Is it a right? Oh, you always take a left instead of a right. And that to me threw into relief the gravity of the place, and it was really scary. I really wanted to get out of there.
Yeah, after a while I did too. I mean, I was very happy to see it in the rearview mirror when we left. It was done, and it was my last trip there. No.
It's interesting. These Trochenbrothers have a quite active group. I don't know what you call it, a support group, a community, in Israel and in America. And they have a reunion every couple of years. And they go to Trochenbrot every couple of years. And my older brother and my mother went on the most recent trip. And the Americans were rather somber, sort of behaving as you described, the sort of expression of the feelings you were describing. And the Israelis had a huge Israeli flag and were singing Hatikva. And both responses make me uncomfortable.
Yeah.
But it is interesting that those nearly opposite responses came so naturally. It's like on the whatever recent anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. I don't know if this was a couple years ago or more recently, but when Israel flew 2 fighter jets over, and that is not an idea that the American Jewish community. I mean, we happen not to have fighter jets.
Well, I mean, it's funny you mentioned that. I had a similar experience on the same trip I was. Since I was in Krakow, I went down. And you've been. Yes. So you remember there's that one destroyed crematorium that they just left in ruins. And when I was there, when I walked along there was a tiny Israeli flag planted. And of course, I wept like a baby the minute I saw it. And then I recovered my senses a little and thought, Israel is not any compensation for what happened here. And if the choice was between the state in 1948 and another 100 years of struggle against the European Jewish community, we all know what we would have chosen. And I also had the same kind of discomfort, like, yes, but. Yeah. In your book, in the first book, your first book is one of the most important exercises in the retrieval of a certain kind of Jewish historical memory in many years. But the thing that's so fascinating about it is, maybe we can talk about this, is the techniques that you chose to use to retrieve this memory. Because they are, as everyone who's read the book knows, they are unexpected and flamboyant and playful in a dark way, and sometimes not even in a dark way. And what was remarkable about it was that all these new techniques, you exploded the traditional narrative and the commonplaces of American Jewish morbidity, and instead you chose to play these. They're not games, but to use these, and yet these techniques have the effect of commemoration in some way. So maybe you could talk a little about what your thought processes were. That's silly, but about the resources that you use to retrieve this memory.
Well, I could say 2 things. One, there's an old expression that a bird is not an ornithologist. Just to do something doesn't imply that you choose to do it that way, that you can explain why you do it or you want to. Writing, when it's going best for me, is not an intellectual process at all. And it's much more visceral and intuitive, and it comes out that way because that's what is inside of me, I guess, or that's the machine that puts stuff outside. The other thing I would say is just to get back to what you were saying about Zadie Smith and the writers after her falling in the same vein, where there's a kind of recognition of information. I think there are 2 kinds of recognition that can happen. One is a recognition that is really based in information, like, oh, she would say that in that situation, or this is Jonathan Franzen very much writes in the line of information. And when people say
he's about getting it right,
he writes about America. Yeah, he gets the details of America precisely right, or the America he's writing about. These are the concerns of the housewife. This is the kind of car they drive. The toast always burns. It's this and that. But there's another kind of recognition that happens in art, which excites me a lot more, which is a visceral recognition or a musical recognition, something that is, I would even say, pre-conscious and has nothing to do with information. And that's what go to books for as a reader. It's what I go to books for as a writer. So if things come out in a way that seems different or at all experimental, it's not because I value difference or the experiment. I don't actually. I value the recognition. And being a 23-year-old in the year 1999, exposed to the kinds of media that I was, the kinds of stories that I was as a child and then as a student, it was inevitable if I was going to write from a visceral place that some of that was going to be reflected.
Meaning that it would be associated, it would be like sampling of some kind.
Yeah, I hate putting it in those terms.
Right, it's trivializing, but there's some way in which, not linear, not logical, not the straight narrative.
It's amazing how conservative the novel has been.
Yeah.
I mean, it's if you step back and compare it to the other art forms in the 20th century, you know, if you put an image in a novel, it is considered either a gimmick or experimental or just different. Imagine an art critic drawing attention to text in a painting. The person would be laughed out of town. Visual arts have been incorporating text for thousands of years. If you think about what is in a gallery in Chelsea now as compared to what might have been in a palace 100, 200 years ago, they don't recognize one another as art. And yet, with literature, we keep wanting this sort of photorealistic portrait. We actually want our novelists to paint the Mona Lisa.
It's even worse in a subject like the memory of the Holocaust, because it is the commonplace assumption is that the highest thing you can aspire to is either testimony or something like testimony. And there's been, as you know, decades of debate about whether there's anything even legitimate about the imagination when it comes to things like this. I mean, it was a cliche when I was growing up. Everyone just loved to say that, you don't need the imagination because reality so far outstrips it, will never catch up, all that stuff. And in fact, your book is premised on a rejection of that. Because your imagination was not inhibited by the gravity or the enormity, or, if you will, the sanctity of the subject. What's so surprising about that book is that you take a subject of such gravity and enormity and some dark sanctity, some negative sanctity, and yet one has the rush of the imagination and the feeling of this book.
Well, I was not trying to be irreverent, I was trying to be reverential.
I know that's what's so interesting.
It's that, to me, irreverence would have been imitating testimony. Or,
that's correct.
Appealing to someone else's notion of what a respectful way of dealing with material was, when in fact I knew that I had. I knew my own sensitivity, and did my best to transform it into ink on a page. And I wouldn't argue with somebody who thought I did a poor job. I wouldn't argue with somebody who said you weren't taking this event with sufficient seriousness. The only response is I was. The only response is this is how I felt, this is how I saw it, this is how I thought about it.
But your point is a good one. It's not just the emotional honesty of proceeding that way, but also the honesty of the admission that one would not dare presume to describe it in a way that would indicate that one believes one actually knows what it was really like. Because that, in a way, is the most blasphemous thing. I mean, I remember there's a scene in Schindler's List, which is a movie that I don't like, but I'm very glad it was made, in which the camera goes through a door into the actual showers. And when that happened, the blood rushed to my head, and I thought, how dare he? How dare he? The idea that he knows what that looked like. Nobody knows what that looked like, because nobody came out of those showers. And I thought that was a perfect example of misplaced piety, misplaced reverence. That we're going to get it so right, show you just what it looked like. And when you have to show just what it looked like, you almost invariably get it wrong.
Well, he was in a funny position because he wasn't making the film as an artist purely. Right. I mean, he was making it as a kind of historian, as a disseminator of information or going to be the definitive Holocaust movie in America at that time.
No, in terms of international pedagogy, it was a very important thing. But when they were preparing to shoot that movie, Spielberg actually asked permission to shoot it in Auschwitz. And of course, permission was wisely denied. And about 20 kilometers.
Who grants it?
There's the people who, if you pardon the expression, who run Auschwitz. I mean, it gets, whenever you talk about Auschwitz, there's no verb you can use now that is Nazi. So it's just impossible. I mean, I had a cousin who found a closet somewhere, was doing research and found a closet in Auschwitz, out of which spilled all the photographs that all the Jews had brought. You can imagine how moving that was, with all the family pictures.
When was this?
This was about 10 years ago, 12 years ago.
Not until 10 years ago?
Yeah, just how they spilled. She produced the book, the publishing house, Auschwitz actually, the Auschwitz authorities, again, it's impossible to talk about, but they have a publishing house that produces documentary material. And she was very excited about this and got permission to make a book out of this, and she sent me a postcard informing me in a very happy way. She said, I've got great news, I've been given the run of Auschwitz. And so it's, this kind of familiarity is, and what you did was, your techniques had the effect of distancing the book in some way by making it strange or unexpected. And it's hard to think of there are very few other writers on that subject or filmmakers on that subject would recognize that.
I think, again, it might reflect a generational difference.
Yeah.
Like, it is strange to be third generation in a way that second generation is not strange. Like the experience, it's not a diluted experience, it's an entirely different experience.
Right. And if you're in the second generation, you're always in some way speaking for your parents, protecting your parents, and so on and so forth. And that's right. But of course, this is what the future is going to be like, because as time goes by, as time goes by, the survivors, they should live till 150. There will not be any more survivors among us, and the Holocaust will recede into the long line of the Jewish disasters. And in a way, I think that's a good thing, because Jews don't understand. I mean, we have suffered from so much unnatural oblivion, and we don't understand the beauty of natural oblivion. I mean, it's okay. I mean, this is the way culture works. This is the way history works. Things are forgotten, new things come in. If things weren't forgotten, nobody would be able to breathe 500 years later, and so on. And your book, I thought, was an indication that the third generation was different.
Yeah, I'd be curious if there is a fourth generation.
Well, that's right.
Or if the fourth generation is a new first generation of Jew. I just don't know if young Jewish writers will address this material in 10, 20, 30 years.
But that's entirely possible.
And it's funny, you said something in the beginning about it being the most tired subject. I knew exactly what you meant, but I still think we actually need a lot more novels written about it. And I will forgive all of the bad ones.
Yes, so will
I had a friend over, a nearly former friend, who was talking about
very fun thing.
talking about a new novel that was coming out, and I didn't know anything about it. And he said, "Yeah, it's just what the world needs. It's another Holocaust novel." And I agreed because I knew what he meant. I knew what he meant. But you only have to find some real point of access into the experience, whether it's talking to a survivor or having some primary relationship with it, insofar as that's possible, to know that it is exactly what the world needs. There haven't been enough, and this is not something that we should be. I don't think we are ready for it to recede.
No, I think that's right. There is a distinction between knowledge and belief. In other words, I know the older I get, I know more and more about why it happened, and it's harder and harder for me to understand that it happened. The sheer fact of it just beggars belief. And you're right. That means that ways have to be found in a way to break through. Look, the other genre of writing about the Holocaust that is that actually is one of the great intellectual triumphs of the last 50 years, certainly in the Jewish community, is the scholarship of the Holocaust, which is the most astonishing phenomenon. I mean, at a high level, shelves and shelves and shelves. But what that means is that a way has to be found to bust it open sometime. I mean, it has to be found to bust it open. You say you haven't looked at that first book.
No, maybe I've had some reason to look at a paragraph, but I'm sure if I were to reread it, I would be surprised by a lot of it. I just have no memory of it.
Let's talk a little bit about, before we open the question, let's talk a little bit about your most recent book, your evangelical book.
They're all evangelical.
Not the way the last one is. Not the way the last one is, brother. No. It's, many years ago, 20 years ago, the Bronfmans allowed Gary Rosenblatt and myself to establish a fund for investigative Jewish journalism. And the idea behind this project was we were going to get a Jewish journalist the Pulitzer Prize, finally. And we decided, now it didn't work for a whole variety of reasons, some of which are quite common, but the piece that we were looking for, more than anything else, was an expose of the kosher industry. We decided that, and it was the problem.
13 years old.
And now precocious you are at the time, I should have found you. But of course, it turned out to be impossible to get because you needed a good reporter who also was an economist who knew halacha. It's tricky. But I remember we had long conversations saying the great subject is kosher. I mean, the cruelties of it, the non-cruelties of it, the whole thing. And I know that this is something that has been a cause of yours in some way for a while. Maybe you should talk a little bit about it to all these kosher Jews.
No, I don't think of it as a cause. I really don't. And I don't think of myself as an activist or proselytizer despite having written this book. It was a very personal inquiry which began when I was a kid. It says nothing at all about whether the activity is right or wrong, but eating animals is antithetical to the other lessons that our parents teach us about what it means to be a kind person in the world. It requires exploration. The heroes of our bedtime stories are almost always animals. Kids have a stuffed animal that they're handed when they start crying. You have a family pet. You treat it with respect, and if somebody abuses it in any way, that person is corrected. But we also do this other thing a couple times a day where we kill and dismember animals and eat their bodies. So I am actually not somebody who thinks that eating animals is in and of itself wrong. I'm not an animal rights person. What I think is that there are some values that nearly everyone shares, and this has been shown out in all kinds of polls, that have to do with the right and wrong ways to treat animals. Keeping a pregnant animal in a cage so small that the animal can't turn around for the duration of its pregnancy. I can't imagine a person who would want to endorse that. I certainly can't imagine somebody in a room like this wanting to endorse it.
Well, there are Talmudic concepts that would forbid it, actually.
I mean, there are Jewish concepts that would forbid basically all American animal farming, as it turns out. And a lot of rabbis have come out very strongly against it. The problem is this, that we continue to hold in our minds an image of a farm that actually hasn't existed for about 30 years or 40 years. And it enables us to eat meat, because we believe animals are treated with a kind of respect. Not that they're given names, not that they're allowed into the house of the farmer. That's not what I mean. I mean that they don't have appendages removed without anesthetics, that they don't have their babies ripped away in the most callous of all ways, that they aren't kept in cages so small they can't turn around, that they aren't bred in such a way that suffering is an inevitability, in such a way that the turkeys we eat at Thanksgiving are incapable of reproducing sexually. All of them, every single turkey sold in every single supermarket in the United States has been bred to such an extent that it cannot reproduce sexually. I think that bothers people when they find out about it, especially when what we're talking about is something that we don't need. Or at least we don't eat it 2 or 3 times a day. We don't eat it every day.
So what troubles you is not the eating of meat so much as the coarsening of the moral sensibilities that are involved in the way that, or the different styles, different styles produce.
Absolutely. And not only, I mean, animal welfare is one piece of the puzzle. At least as important to me is the environmental argument against animal farming. It's the #1 cause of global warming. It produces more greenhouse gas emissions than everything else in the world put together. So we are people who, in this room, probably give some thought to the fuel efficiency of the cars we might buy, to the kinds of light bulbs that we use. We
have to have Empire Chicken offsets.
you could ride your bike all day long and it wouldn't offset your Empire Chicken. The United Nations said it's one of the top 2 or 3 causes of every significant environmental problem on the planet. We know definitively that it's making our antibiotics less effective. Antibiotics that our kids depend on, that we depend on. We are going to, in the not too distant future, be unable to use antibiotics. For what? For nothing. For something we don't need, something we like. And I am not somebody who scoffs at the pleasure of food. I'm somebody who thinks meat smells great, and I remember what it tasted like. I thought it tasted great, and I know what the cultural significance of meat can be. Very substantial, but it's not as substantial as what we're giving up.
So you are a vegetarian? You don't?
I am.
Yeah. You know, Bashetta Singer, who was a vegetarian, once said something wonderful. He said that when asked about this, he said that the important thing about vegetarianism is that whereas all animals eat other animals, only a moral creature like a human being could choose not to eat another. It was a very, very fine, wonderful speech.
Yeah. I mean, I should say I don't think about this in terms of vegetarian and non-vegetarian. I think about it in terms of eating as little meat as possible. These problems will not be solved if 20% of the world becomes vegetarian. And I think it's unlikely that 20% of the world will become vegetarian. But if Americans ate 1 less serving of meat a week, it would environmentally be the equivalent of taking 6 million cars off the road. So if someone says to me I can't become a vegetarian, I have no argument with that person. If someone says I can't eat 1 less serving of meat a week, that starts to sound pathological.
Of course, we know Americans have no interest in taking 6 million cars off the road.
Right, but the people in this room might.
Yes, this is an exceptionally large story. As we'll find out, I think what we should do is we should we'll take questions, and we'll take questions until it seems exhausted. Or do we proceed exhausted? Sir.
I was just curious about your earlier comment where you said you felt uncomfortable both at the American and the Israeli reaction at the camp, and I was just curious if you could maybe expound why you felt that way.
Well, I should say every reaction will make me uncomfortable because there's no appropriate reaction. I mean, it defies. There is nothing to say. There's nothing to do. My experience was being there was it, and I didn't know what to do with myself. I didn't know what to do with my hands. I didn't know what to look at. I didn't know what should I. This was my wife. Should I talk to her? Should I not? I was at a loss. So I don't mean to imply that I knew what was appropriate. I just meant that the flags and the singing. I guess I would agree with Leon that it felt like things were being put on opposite sides of an equal sign, and that made me uncomfortable. That Israel redeemed the Holocaust, or that I didn't want them in the same sort of mental sentence, I guess. And in terms of the sullenness or the silence, it felt like one wants to, you want to create a marker. You want to somehow contribute significance to being there, but it's impossible.
I want one little comment and a question. The book you referred to by Charlotte
Solomon. Yes.
Charlotte Solomon. Okay, what's the name of that
It's
book?
called Life or
I
Theater.
can talk about it a little because it's not a.
Oh,
I don't
yes.
understand what that book is.
Yeah, so Charlotte Solomon died in the war. And she was originally from the Netherlands, but ended up spending a lot of time in the south of France with her grandparents, and ended up in Auschwitz. But she created this document which is very hard to describe and easy to understand when you see it. It's about 800 or so watercolor washes with text incorporated into them. So you could say that it's a novel. You could also say she wrote it, she described it as a kind of opera, because there's some music involved or recommended listening while you're reading it. I mean, as a work of visual art, I think it's the best work of visual art. Best, it doesn't mean anything. It's what I would take to a desert island. As a literature, it's what I would take to a desert island. But as a historical artifact, it's as rich as anything else.
It's a genuine epic.
Yeah.
It's a genuine epic.
And it's called Life and
Life or theater, question
or
mark.
Theater.
Life or theater.
One other just little comment, Leanne, was interesting to me when you're talking about Jewish authors and angst. It took me back, and I hope not to recognize, Richard Nixon is an expert on Jews. But what appeared in the Washington Post and the New York Times in terms of its ruminations or comments about Jews is one of the things he said is Jews they're very insecure.
Not like Nixon.
Right. They've been looking in the mirror, but it was interesting because it's maybe only a step away from his whatever it is. It may be an insight in the angst that you talk about.
No, it's not as bad. I just have to say, I've been insane about this all day. It's not as bad as what Kissinger was quite insane. There was a meeting.
This is recent.
The Nixon Library dumped another 200 hours of transcripts of tape. And there was a meeting in '73 with Golda Meir at the White House. And after she left, Nixon and Kissinger were talking to reporters, and some reporter clearly brought up Jackson Van Eyck about Soviet Jews. So Kissinger begins by saying that the emigration of Jews from the Soviet Union is not an objective of American foreign policy. Okay, we know, we felt that. This is what he follows with. He says, if Jews in the Soviet Union were being put into gas chambers, it would not be an American concern. Maybe, he said, maybe a humanitarian concern. It's absolutely, I mean, I hope he chokes on his next foie gras. Carol?
That's a good question.
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah. So she had asked, what does it mean to work harder? I think you were remembering what Joyce Carol had said. Anyways, what does it mean to work harder when work is not an intellectual process, but is more visceral and intuitive? Joseph Brodsky said the rhyme is smarter than the poet, and a lot of writing is creating problems for yourself to find solutions for. It's not generating something out of nothing so much as trying to be in the way of fortuitous accidents or trying to notice the thing that you didn't intend but you desire. And so working harder for me is just the most straightforward way of working more hours.
Actually working.
Yeah, I don't think that one writes when one isn't writing. I just don't buy that. I actually don't even think that one thinks when one isn't writing, and by one I represent me. I am not someone who walks around with an interior monologue. If I'm not actively responding to somebody or writing, I'm not thinking. And I'm certainly not doing good thinking. So, writing is this incredibly inefficient process of trying to bring about these accidental or fortuitous happenings. And the more you are sitting there trying, the better are your odds of bringing them about. So, for example, I haven't really known what I wanted to write for quite a long time now. And I've been, about half a year ago, I started to feel some desperation. Like it's just not happening. There's nothing I care about enough. I can't choose anything. And so I started waking up at 4. And I would work from 4 until my kids get up. Why? Do I need those 2 hours of the day? Maybe it contributes. It was the working harder for me. It was reminding myself this is an act of will. It's not magic. There's no inspiration. There are no muses. You just sit there. You look at the page. And what have I been doing in those 6 months? I've been writing really without any direction at all. I've just been filling the pages because there is some good that comes from filling pages, from filling blank pages. And lo and behold, every now and then, I'll look at a paragraph and say, that's a kind of interesting little thing. And that sentence, I wasn't writing toward that sentence, but that sentence came about simply because I filled these pages from 4 to 6. And that appeals to me, that means something to me, and I want to try to build off of that.
When I hear you say this, and I have other writer friends who say this, I'm always reminded, you ever gotten a haircut in an old-fashioned barbershop? You remember how they do this with the scissors, but even when they're not cutting their hair, the scissors keep going. And then they kind of bring them in and get the hair. It's sort of like that.
Isn't this colloquy almost a testimony to the natural history of the Jewish people? So when you say maybe it's better that the Holocaust recedes so that we can experience a natural cataclysm or a natural disaster, or if something in the ordinary opposed something cataclysmic. And here, the third generation following the Holocaust deniers and the ones before this that do great scholarship now says, I didn't know what questions to ask. I didn't know what to ask. And out of this, because I didn't know what questions to ask, came monumental questions. But if the fourth generation says, Mazel, what's this, and doesn't ask the questions, then aren't we doomed for another cataclysmic event?
Well, I'm going to permit myself to answer that. I'm not sure, first of all, that the behavior of the Jews, whether the Jews remember or forget, if another cataclysm happens, it won't be anything. It's not about the Jews, it's about the non-Jews and what will be happening. So there's that. The second thing I would say is that what you say is right in this sense. Ways have to be found to perpetuate the memory. And the old traditional ways of perpetuating Jewish collective memory don't work anymore, at least in the Mass. Ritual, liturgy, and even when they did work, things were also forgotten. After the Second Crusade, there was a fast day that was instituted, and it lasted 300 years, which is a very long time, but it disappeared. And that's what I meant before when I said Jews have to understand and even permit ourselves, I guess it's part of what the Zionists used to call the normalization of the Jewish people, permit ourselves an appreciation of natural oblivion. In other words, the things that, more things about the Jewish tradition are being forgotten in the United States by the American Jewish community in circumstances of peace and prosperity and security than ever were forgotten in the most miserable Jewish communities that lived anywhere. So,
what things are you talking about?
The tradition itself, the Hebrew language, knowledge, prayer, basic competence with the Jewish tradition. Quantities are slipping through our fingers, vast quantities. And what this means is that new ways have got to be found. Now, it gets complicated because more and more people are going to begin to rely on the pseudo-memory of the computer, basically. In other words, in the age of the internet, there will be no more oblivion. And everything will be easily accessed and nothing will be truly known. And so we have a challenge to see, we pioneered certain techniques of collective memory, the Jewish people. And those techniques are they're not working anymore. And so the interesting question, and one of the things that Jonathan was talking about, I think, was the place of literature and art, of the imagination in pioneering, in securing that kind of memory.
So I have a question about your most recent book, Tree of Codes. How much of it since it's both a book in that it has a plot, character, and all those things, but it's also something of a three-dimensional piece of art in the way that you cut certain, that's actual. So how much of it for you was making a novel out of another person's novel, and how much of it was you working in a sort of three-dimensional visual art kind of space?
So this is a book that is, it was published by an independent art press, basically. That's what I bought. It's in a very limited edition. You probably can't find it in the bookstore. object, you can see, literally stumble, you can see it. So, because this is a real case of the writer being smarter than the poet, because it was so constrained, the process was so constrained. It's not like I could have thought, oh, I'd like to write a story about X, Y, or Z. I could only write a story about what those pages afforded me. It's like being presented with a palette of only, black, gray, and brown, and saying, I think I'm going to paint a summer day. It just wouldn't work. So my palette were Schultz's words. But it has nothing in the world to do with Street of Crocodiles. I mean, I wanted to depart from this as far as I could. It's not any kind of homage or anything like that at all. I really wanted to make an independent work of art, just taking what I think is the richest of all palettes, in terms for literary palettes, which is that book. And what came out is what came out. I could have done 1,000 different versions, but this was the one I was most happy with.
If you could, would you give us a little background into the creation of Extremely Loud?
Sure. Yes, we do. A little background into the creation of it. I was writing at the end of, on the back flap of Everything is Illuminated, where there's the author photo and a little biography. The last sentence of the biography is, he's currently at work on a novel which takes place in a museum. And that was only there because I was sure that I was going to finish that book. It was about 2/3 done when my first book came out. Finished. I went into it and say done. And then I ended up writing this very different book. But it's not that I put that one down to start a new one. It's little by little I replaced one book with the pieces of another book. And maybe it was in response to world events, although it didn't feel that way at the time. I came upon a voice that I was really attracted to. The hero, the boy. It just had an energy that I liked, that I craved at that moment. That I wouldn't crave it now. I craved it then. It was what I wanted to write inside it. And it's interesting. I was saying that Judaism has been a kind of magnet. So have fathers. It doesn't make me unique among writers, but it's kind of difficult not to write about fathers. And fatherhood and absent fathers. Even my father's as present as any father probably has ever been. But which is precisely the problem.
The little remoteness can go a long way.
So in any case, I found myself working on this on the side, and I would periodically send bits of it to friends and say, "Oh, isn't this a funny little thing?" And I found that I was working on it more and more and sharing it with friends more and more. And I thought, well, what's the point of my writing if not spending my time with writing that I want to work on and want to share. And so I ended up switching, but it was not. It was no more premeditated or intellectualized than the process I described in the first book.
You've been described as a Jewish writer, either by Leon or by yourself. I'm interested in what your
Those
moral...
are two very unreliable.
in terms of your moral core and how you would deal with, for example, vegetarianism may be a conceit of a very high-level society, and animal protein may be necessary for a society that's struggling. You're wearing shoes that look like they might be leather. Leon's, I assume, are leather. The shirt you're sitting on is leather. How do you reconcile all these different considerations? And also, on the Holocaust issue, would you write it when Roberto Benigni wrote "Life is Beautiful"? Is the Holocaust is treating the Holocaust as humor morally acceptable?
Well, you've asked a lot of questions. Let me see if I can remember everything you said. So animal protein is not necessary, and you really won't find a nutritionist who says that it is. Protein is necessary. The American Dietetic Association has said that vegetarians tend to have a more optimal protein consumption than meat eaters. So if protein is the thing that we're worried about, then we should really move toward a plant-based diet. The shoes I'm wearing are made of leather. I bought these for my wedding. And I don't buy leather products anymore, but I wouldn't throw away ones that I own because that's silly. I mean, it doesn't save an animal. It only wastes a pair of perfectly nice shoes, in this case, exceedingly nice shoes.
Which were made in a stress-free environment.
Yeah,
Sure, yeah.
yeah, for your energy. I'm not interested in absolutes. Like, unfortunately, here's what I mean. The conversation around how we should treat animals and how we should, basically around meat, it always wants to go to the extreme. It always wants to go to, but you're wearing other shoes, or but you swat flies, or but what happens when you have a rat problem in your house? Do you not get an exterminator? Or, but don't you know that when you walk on the ground, you're crushing hundreds of insects? Yes, all of that is true. And it's also true that I occasionally tell white lies, and it's also true that I occasionally break the speed limit, and it's also true that I'm occasionally jealous of my neighbors or friends, or that I'm not kind enough, sufficiently kind to, as I would aspire to be. But that doesn't mean I throw my hands up in the air and say I'm going to stop trying.
No, but do you find your moral values in Judaism or Jewish values, or just general values? As a Jewish writer.
Well, I don't know that I could separate the strands. You know, I was told certain stories when I was growing up, and I was handed down certain values from my grandmother and my grandparents and my parents. And some of them probably are singularly Jewish, or at least find their basis, maybe even in the stories of Genesis. But a lot of them also happen to be shared with friends of mine who aren't Jewish. I don't know that it's easy to distinguish between the two. I mean, let me tell you this. I think I have a special sensitivity to food because of kashrut, because of the ways that the laws of kashrut were described to me when I was a kid, when I was in Hebrew school. The idea that this is something to be proud of. This is not a law with no meaning behind it. It's not an arbitrary ritual that we fulfill because we're told to. It is something that has a significance that can be articulated, an ethical or moral significance that can be articulated and that we should be proud of, which is we hold ourselves to a higher standard. A compromise was made with God that we want to eat flesh. If we're going to do so, we have to do it in these certain ways that remember that an animal is not the same as a carrot, is not the same as a vegetable, and shouldn't be treated should be treated differently. I liked that idea, and I was a meat eater when I learned that idea, and I'll continue to be a meat eater. But the question has become in this world, which is a different world even than when I learned about kashrut 20 years ago. In this world, 99% of the animals that we eat come from factory farms. 99% of the animals that we eat are raised in a process that is the most destructive thing that we as individuals do to the environment, and is clearly antithetical to the ways that most of us think about treating animals. If we were to enter a factory farm, there's not a person in this room who would tolerate it. And so it's the distance that has eased our conscience, I suppose. And that doesn't feel good to me. And I think it feels especially bad to me because of these lessons I was told in Hebrew school.
I've asked both of you because you have the opportunity, because you've written a book on a beautiful child, and on the question of the Holocaust. I'm thinking about the fact that my granddaughter just came back earlier in the fall from a trip with her schoolmates in Israel, a trip to Poland, and she said to me, well, now that I know, it was horrible, and it was hurtful, and it was terrible, and she was
something he heard in school, and I told him about his relationship, his familial relationship to what happened. And it occurred to me, it reinforced something that I've noticed about children's literature generally, which is that if you read fairy tales, they are famously cruel and sadistic. Now, the question, as I began to ponder this problem, I realized that having children know the facts of evil before they can completely understand evil is the only way to induct them into that understanding. In other words, if we waited until they were old enough to understand it and one day told them what happened, they would fall to pieces. So I think, and this, by the way, is true of the way I've noticed, philosophers for decades used to argue about whether language is learned by meaning or by use. If you have a little child, you know it's learned by use. Because, my little boy would say things like, Daddy, I have a strong emotion. What's an emotion? and from the syntax of his sentence, it was clear to me that he was using the word emotion correctly. He just didn't know what it meant. So, and I think that there is this, they're going to find, there's no way to control the information. He found out sooner than I would have chosen to have him find out. In his fascination with military history, I will not allow books about the Second World War that show certain photographs because they're beyond his, they're beyond my comprehension, they're beyond his comprehension. But somehow, children learn about the brutality of the world, and Jewish children will learn about the brutality of the world towards Jews in that way. And so now it's really about keeping pace with what he thinks he knows and understands. I'll tell you, the question of the fourth generation, the fifth generation, this is a solemn responsibility that the Jewish community has to take upon itself. And again, not only about the Holocaust.
Well, wait a second, does it have to do with literature?
It has something to do with literature, but it can't have only to do with literature because the vast majority of all people don't read literature, or at least serious literature. They just don't. In the Jewish tradition, there was extraordinary literature produced as a consequence of various persecutions, liturgical poems, narratives, and so on. But the thing that kept the memory alive was ritual and liturgy. That's what kept the memory alive. And as I said earlier, I think we need to find either new ways to that or substitutes for that. I don't have an answer for this. It perplexes me greatly. Mark. Oh, sorry, John.
The only thing I would add is it's very difficult to write something good on purpose. And I think that, in the effort to write the kind of thing that you're imagining, you would probably write something that was phony. And it's a real problem in writing. Intentions don't help. Novels can be wonderfully and powerfully political, but a novel that is, I think that political intentions create bad novels.
More.
Jonathan, I've been thinking for months what question I wanted to ask you, and now that I have a chance, the only thing I can think of is to thank you for having the comedic brilliance to name a dog Sammy Davis Jr. And the real question in there is, Leon talked about different styles you used in the book, and I'm wondering if humor like that is in there to strictly to break the tension, or most of it has a point, satirical or otherwise. Much of you're mournful of the loss of a shtetl in the book, but it's also quite funny too and fantastical, and the carnival and all the rest of it. And I was wondering if we were supposed to laugh there or learn something that you thought about what you found.
If David has his sense too, let's talk a little bit about humor and the most people's subject.
I guess I believed when I was writing my first book that a book could contain everything. And I wanted it to be as full as life. And then I wrote my book and I saw that I had 2% of the fullness that I wanted to try to express. So then I'll write another book because I've read a bunch of books in the meantime and I've learned a lot about writing. I wrote a second book and it was 1%. This isn't good. But I could do another and I might be able to, and then 0.5%. The good news is I've come to value those diminishing returns a lot. But I wouldn't have, when I wrote my first book, I wouldn't have understood writing a book that wasn't also humorous, and also tragic, and also magical, and also severe at times, and also stream of consciousness, and also highly, highly stylized. It's not right. It's not the correct way to think about novels. It's not, I teach, and I do not encourage my students to write as I do, because I don't think there is a right way to write. I don't think that my way is to be recommended, but it's the way that I do it because, how to put this? I don't feel like I have many different novels to choose. I don't, it's as I was trying to say before, I don't feel that there are 20 novels I want to or could write, and which should I choose? Well, I could do this one, that, and there are advantages and disadvantages. For me, it's like looking for a life raft, and it's very, very, very difficult to write. And when I stumble upon material that feels authentic to me, that is the test. Then I do it. And I know that might not sound like much of an answer to your question, especially if you were hoping for me to say something about how humor can, more fully open up a reader for the tragedy that comes, or it can put the tragedy into a kind of relief that makes it more, that gives it more impact. Those things might very well be true.
One thing that could be added, though, is that the reason that gallows humor is probably the funniest humor of all is because jokes can represent a genuine spiritual triumph over circumstance. I mean, if you can laugh at certain things, then you have not been destroyed in some way. It really is about, we're in shul, it's about the intactness of the neshama in some way. And jokes can actually represent that. Not always, and not bad jokes. but it can amount to that. And that's why, I've never had a problem with when the Benini movie came out. I've never had a problem about the validity of humor. Obviously every treatment of the subject has to prove its own validity. But humor is a primary spiritual expression.
There are two things I often think about when I think about gallows humor. One is a book called Phantoms in the Brain by someone named V.S. Roman Chandra. He's a neuroscientist. And he investigates humor at a certain point in the book and posits that basically the laugh or the joke is every joke is dependent on the possibility of something having gone terribly wrong, but not having gone wrong. So, the sort of quintessential joke is the person slipping on a banana peel. So if we were to watch someone walking down the street slip on a banana peel and not get up, that's not funny. Nobody laughs at that. When we see the person slip on a banana peel and get up, Henry Kissinger would depend. But when the person slips and gets up and brushes himself off, we laugh because we know about the possibility of him not having done that. And he goes on to say that this idea that something that seems like a threat is okay is an incredibly important message for tribes, which is why contagious laughter exists. This is a message that's very useful to pass on quickly and widely. And it's also interesting in terms of how Holocaust humor is, if you think about it through this lens, regarded in Israel and the United States. It's very different. There is no, as far as I know, no taboo against Holocaust humor in Israel. Not at all like here. And if that has anything to do with a feeling of having recovered from something or a threat being somehow mitigated, that would be interesting. The other thing that comes to mind is a passage from Sea Under Love by David Grossman. And this is very much along the lines of what Leon was saying, where one of the characters says, imagine you were God and you wanted your creations to worship you as befitted a real deity. Not in a sentimental way, not in a thoughtless way, not by getting on their hands and knees and telling you how great you are, but to really appreciate the wonder of your creation. Humor is the way to do that, he says. because every joke depends on appreciation of symmetry, coincidence, nuance, what seems like design, the fullness of the world. Bringing two disparate things together. And he goes on to talk about a rabbi's son and how, and his laugh, and how unlike his secular voice, it sounds as if its function, if it were an elevated function that couldn't possibly be conveyed as we speak. So those two things I often think about in the Grossman in particular.
I mean, I think my single favorite joke in the world is about the man sitting at the bottom of the Titanic, staring into his glass and muttering, "I asked for ice, but this is ridiculous." I mean, that is a triumph over adversity. What that is. And it's taking tragedy very seriously.
Would you like to hear my favorite joke?
Yes.
When does a policeman smell?
What is the what?
When does a policeman smell? When he's on duty? I have two. Now my favorite jokes. My favorite jokes.
In a short time there will be no survivors, real survivors left. And you have skirted around this, how to bridge the gap. And there seems to be a huge difference between my college students hearing a real survivor and seeing films about survivors. I don't know if you have any.
Well, I'll say this. I always thought that whereas the centrality of the survivors, the presence of the survivors to the American Jewish appreciation of what happened is easy to understand, I've always thought that it's slightly outrageous the extent to which American Jews have depended upon the presence of survivors to understand these things. In other words, I mean, I include survivors among my own parents. One of my parents is no longer alive, one of them is. But she will not live forever. And the idea that my responsibility towards the memory of what happened, and again, we use the word memory. I mean, this is the trick about memory. We're talking about memory. It's the memory of something that didn't happen to me. I mean, that's the trick about collective memory. But it is memory. It's not just knowledge, because it has the intimacy and the urgency of memory. My responsibility to know what happened in the Holocaust, I've always thought, has no. The fact that I'm a child of survivors should have no bearing. I think every Jew has that responsibility. It is a special honor of mine to be the son of my parents. But I think that when the survivors are here and when the survivors are no longer here, the responsibility is the same. The responsibility is the same. And American Jews, and it's not just in the case of the memory of the Holocaust, American Jewish identity in so many aspects has been a vicarious identity for so long. American Jews live through the experience of other Jews. They're used to this, and at some point, they're going to have to take responsibility for what they understand.
How come there has been so much literature about the Holocaust and about many other forms of extermination of Jews?
How come there has been? How could there not have been?
That much more, it seems to me.
But how could there not have been? It's the single most shocking thing that anyone... But there have been many other persecutions, and there have been many other attempts to exterminate Jews, and not nearly as much literature. Well, I'll tell you, quantitatively that may be true, but the medieval persecutions produced vast literatures. We don't know them. Vast literatures. Poems, prayers, narratives, shelves and shelves of this stuff. There was always a Jewish literary response to catastrophe. We now live in a historical culture, and so scholarship was produced of a kind that was never produced before. That was the new thing. That was the innovation, not the literature.
Hi, thank you for coming. You seem to be addressing two really difficult issues.
No.
One of them is, and both of them we kind of run under the understanding of sort of extreme. In the Holocaust, you're saying we should be kind of distancing and not doing testimony as much, but when it comes to animals, you're saying yes, we need to go look in the face and see it. And I'm just curious if you can talk about what's the driving, or what's the difference between those two, because it almost seems to me that if we're going to talk about maybe fourth and fifth generation who won't have those survivors to speak to, they might go back to that looking for the authentic, kind of paralleling what you're doing with the niche. We need to go look it in the face again to experience that shock.
Well, you know, with everything is Illuminated, I wasn't trying to write any kind of definitive book about the Holocaust. I was writing a book about my experience, which is entirely different. I don't mean because it's subjective and not objective, but because I was writing a book about 1999, not a book about the early 1940s. So I was staring it in the face. It's just that what I was looking at was, you know, the experience that I had of having my grandmother, mother having a kind of absent ancestral homeland. And I tried to express that as truthfully as I could. I also tried to express it with as few words as I could and as straightforwardly as I could. It just so turned out that because of who I was, it took a lot of words and it took a lot of meandering and it took some different styles within the same book. And maybe it required humor as well. But it's not because I was trying to look away from something. It's precisely because I was trying to look at something.
Two more questions.
In the 11 years since you wrote your first book, technology has really kind of exploded. And I was wondering if you ever thought about how your book would have been written and how it would read if you were beginning your research on it now. I'm wondering whether you feel like as a novelist there is still the same capacity for discovery and wonder, given the possibilities we have of knowing so much more before we actually experience something.
I don't know. I mean, I know that when I wrote the book, I had a roommate who spent a lot of time on his computer. And I would say to him, what are you doing on that thing? What is there to do on that? It just seems so boring. And now we all spend a lot of time on our computers. I mean, there's sort of two questions. One is, which Leon was touching on, this kind of relationship between information and knowledge, and why vast amounts of information can equal zero knowledge. And also, what the effect of all this technology will have on just the creative process. You know, the novel is a single-tasked activity. It is slow and inefficient, and it stands in such stark opposition to just the prerogatives of the world now, which are to make everything easier. And the novel prides itself on difficulty. And I have found it more and more difficult to write. And most every writer I know feels the same way. There are not that many reasons to be hopeful about the creation of novels into the future. I hate to deliver depressing news, but I don't know if that's what you were really asking, or if you were really asking about, you know, what is something more simple, which is like, you know, if I wanted to, I could go online now and get a pretty full family tree within about an hour or two. If I, you know, I would do it with the computer, and I could easily. I'm sure there's a trough and broad entry on Wikipedia. I mean, that certainly didn't exist. I could get hooked up with this community of trough and broaders, which I couldn't have without using when I wrote my book. My book was in response to, in many ways, to holes that I found, to absences. And if the absences hadn't been so complete, I doubt I would have written my book.
Don't you find, though, I've noticed since in the decades since everyone's become internet literate or competent, that there are many more thoroughly researched novels that are appearing. In other words, information is assuming a greater and greater role in the writing of novels in ways that become very irritating.
I don't know if that is because, I don't know if that's being driven by novelists or critics. I mean, there's such a value placed on the journalistic novel.
Yeah, that's good.
The idea that something that gets the details right, gets the picture right, is absurd. But it's so highly valued now.
Well, I'm just intrigued by something you said about intentionality before. some of the effect they hardly do anything good on purpose. But I'm just curious, at some
This
point.
guy's a political consultant, he can't agree with that.
At some point, too, you did have the intention of writing the particular book that you wrote, but it was about about eating animals. So at what point are you transitioning from not having the intention to having the intention and still having it be good?
First of all, I should say eating animals was entirely different. In the work of nonfiction, I always knew what I was doing, and I did it. I woke up knowing what I was working on. So I always put that aside. But with the two novels, I might have described it, I might have accidentally made a caricature of what I meant. There's a nice story about how Jackson Pollock would paint toward the end of his life. That he would lay out huge swaths of canvas and walk over them and do his thing. And then when the paint was dry, he would come back, again walk over the canvas and say, here's a 3x5, here's a 6x8. So it's hard, it would be very hard to say that he was making those 3x5 and 6x8 paintings intentionally. And yet it's also somewhat difficult to say he wasn't. I mean, he knew what he was doing. He just didn't know where he would find his paintings. And I guess that's what writing is like with me. I know that in writing, I know that I'm pursuing certain interests. And of course, at certain points, I knew that I was writing a story about my family, about Safran Foer and so on. But I did find my novel within my writing. I always overwrite. I write 5, 10 times as much as I save. And I don't mean, when I say 5 or 10 times as much, I don't mean the garbagey bad ideas that I put in the garbage can. I mean working on a project, knowing that I'm working on that. I still write 5 or 10 times as much. And then writing becomes an act of carving out rather than assembling. So that the first stage of just putting those pages out is, it just feels very generative. It feels very, nothing is off limits. There are a whole series of questions I don't ask myself. Is this worthwhile? Is this intelligent? Is this funny? Is this touching? Is this so on and so forth? And then, as you were suggesting, I enter a different stage when I do ask all of those questions. It's almost a shame that they're both called writing, because they're such different parts of the same activity. And I guess we didn't talk very much about editing, but the process of editing, I think what most people have in mind when they think of a writer writing is actually editing. When for me, the process of writing is very, very physical. It's not mental. It's actually not mental at all.
Since you're talking painters, there was near the end of his life, Matisse was commissioned to paint a chapel in the south of France. And a filmmaker asked permission. He could just bring a camera and shoot him as he was painting. And Matisse agreed, and on condition that he could see the film when it was done. And he painted the fresco, painted the chapel. And then he looked at the movie and he refused to allow the film to be shown. And he explained to the filmmaker that the problem with the film was that it made it look like he knew what he was doing.
Have you ever seen the famous painting of Picasso painting a piece of glass?
Yeah.
And it's clear he doesn't know what he's doing. And it's wonderful. I mean, it's about as inspiring as a piece of process art, or as educational for another artist as could be. It's wonderful because it couldn't change more.
I want to thank the Daremblum family. I want to thank my beloved friend Jonathan Safran Foer. He has agreed to sign books downstairs and have a little schnapps. Thank you all for coming.